Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is John Quigley, and I'm the Assistant Dean for Advancement for the College of Arts and Sciences at SU. I want to welcome you to our program and make a few quick announcements. At this time, I want to ask you to make sure that your microphone is muted. This will ensure that everyone can hear our presenter. We're going to be recording this presentation, and we plan to make it available to the public. If you don't want your image recorded, feel free to disable your video camera by clicking on the camera icon in the lower left-hand corner of your Zoom window. Also, closed captioning services will automatically appear on your screen. If you do not want to view closed captioning, you can click on the caret next to live transcript and select hide subtitle. If time allows, we're going to have question and answer period toward the end of the program. And we will be taking written questions through the chat box in Zoom at that time. Right now, I want to introduce our presenter, Sally Cornelison, Professor of Art History and Director of the Florence Graduate Program in Italian Renaissance Art at SU. Professor Cornelison is a specialist in the history of Italian late medieval and Renaissance religious art. Many of her publications concern art, devotion, ritual, and patronage as they relate to the cult of saints and relics in Renaissance Florence. The focus of her current research is the sacred art of artist, architect, and artist biographer Giorgio Vasari. Sally received her MA in art history from Syracuse and her PhD in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. And she joined the faculty at SU in 2015. So right now, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Cornelison.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to share my screen, so give me a second to set up. And I'm going to do what I do when I teach my classes. I'm going to open the chat and then open you so I can see you, because it helps me to gauge reactions. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. And I'm going to give a special shout out to my Italy friends, because it's 10 p.m. there. So thank you for showing up. And then also I noticed that Caitlin Petty is here, and Caitlin did the Florence Graduate Program in Italian Renaissance Art in 2018, 2019. And we just found out about a half an hour ago, won the Outstanding Master's Prize Award. So this is for you, Caitlin. Good job. So as John said, I'm a specialist in Italian late medieval and Renaissance religious art. And so the study of women in art is not the thing that I do as a scholar. I have touched on it in my research. I've looked at the way that women interacted with the cults of certain saints that I've worked on. But the beauty of being a professor is that you get to teach courses on things that aren't your expertise. And so right now I'm teaching a class on women in art in late medieval and Renaissance Italy. And so I thought that that would be a subject that would be appropriate for a gathering like this. I consider myself a student of this topic, and it's a really fascinating, multivalent topic. And so fasten your seatbelts. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind, because I'm going to touch on a variety of issues pertaining to the representation of women in art, women patrons, and then of course, women artists, which is what I will wind up with. But I did want to give you a little bit of background, because in art history, we pay a lot of attention to what we call historiography, which is literally the history of the history. And the history of the history of Italian Renaissance art really, women in Italian Renaissance art really begins only in the
Sally, you got muted. There you go.
I have no idea how that happened. So what did I last say? Did that just happen? I'll just pick up where I was. Okay.
I think we lost 2 or 3 sentences.
Okay, good. All right, good. So basically the history of the study of women in Italian Renaissance art dates from the early 1970s, when people first started paying attention to this. And it was mostly women scholars, in particular, an art historian by the name of Linda Nochlin, who in 1971 published a seminal article called "Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists?" And that started the ball rolling. 5 years later, in 1976, Linda Nochlin and another art historian, Anne Sutherland Harris, co-curated a groundbreaking exhibition called Women Artists 1550 to 1950. So this dealt with some of the artists that I'll be talking about today, taking women artists all the way up into the 20th century. And from that point, the study of women in art continued to grow. There was an historian, not an art historian, a woman by the name of Joan Kelly, who in 1977 published another fundamental study called Did Women Have a Renaissance? And the response to that question was kind of no. As a matter of fact, what she found in looking at the position of women and how they lived and their status during the period between about 1300 and about 1700 was that, if anything, women's freedoms became more restricted as time went on than becoming more liberating. And I'm just showing you a few images here related to, I'm going to get my little laser pointer up because it's helpful to me. A childbirth scene with a wet nurse here and the mother in bed, very much the kind of confinement scene that would actually take place in Renaissance palaces. Here you see a couple of women who are probably courtesans in Renaissance Venice. And then this is just a lovely painting by my artist, Giorgio Vasari, who I'll talk about in just a little bit, not as an artist, but rather as somebody who was instrumental in helping to add women artists and women patrons to the canon of the study of Renaissance art. So as people became more and more interested in this topic, there were offshoots. For example, the study of domestic art in Renaissance Italy experienced a tremendous boom from the 1990s into the early 2000s, and that continues today. And here I'm showing you a scene from an oratory in Florence in which an inventory of a poor woman, probably a widow's house, is being taken. They're going through a chest, which is where you would keep your most important linens and possessions and things like that. These would be locked up. And then over on the right, you see a painted example, kind of a more posh version of one of these chests that typically were commissioned at the time of marriage. The study of women in art opened up a lot of avenues, and it's also the study of domestic art, because scholars started looking at things like painted furniture or ceramics. Here you have a mythological birth scene, the birth of Hercules, represented on a ceramic plate. And for a long time in the canon of art history, objects like these weren't viewed as being worthy of study because they were so-called minor arts. But now we know that they cost a great deal of money. They are wonderful examples of craftsmanship that may not fit in with later ideals of what was important, but they certainly were very, very important during the Renaissance. All the while, the study of women artists continues. And I'd like to give a shout out to my colleague, Jonathan Nelson, who teaches at the Syracuse Florence Center, who in 2008 published this edited volume of studies of a nun artist. Her name is Plautilla Nelli, as you can see from the cover of the book there. She lived in the 16th century. She was the member of a Dominican order. And so this was a really, the first fundamental study of this woman artist. And it's so very recent. So a lot of this field is very, very new. Nuns as artists, we know that nuns were artists throughout the Middle Ages. They produced a lot of types of works, like they did paint, they did illustrate prayer books and things like that. They also were often known as important producers of embroideries. And this is something that I've actually worked on. These are two garments that were made for the chapel of a Florentine saint, Saint Antoninus, in the late 16th century. And there were nuns from 3 different convents in Florence who produced the textiles that were used in the chapel, including these liturgical garments with these beautiful, beautifully crafted embroidered scenes of the crucifixion here. This one's a little harder to make make out. It shows the scene of the lamentation. So here's the body of Christ, and then the Virgin Mary, who is mourning the death of her son. And in terms of hierarchies, these were very, very prestigious works of art. We don't usually think of textiles as being that way, but textiles were far, far more expensive than paintings, which were usually made with fairly inexpensive materials. And so it's very important to keep in mind what was valued during their time as opposed to what was valued for much of our time. Now, as I've mentioned before, Vasari. So this is the artist who I work on, and I work in particular on Vasari's religious paintings. But Vasari was a true Renaissance man. He was an artist. He was a painter. He painted in frescoes. He painted on panel. He was an architect, a very successful architect. But he's best known for producing a series of lives of artists, which was first published in 1550 and then came out in a second revised and expanded edition in 1568. The title of this book, you can see it. This is the title page right here. It's the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects. And Vasari is really important on a number of levels. Now, he has an agenda, so you have to know how to read Vasari. He embellishes things, tells stories, but there's always a point to those stories. And Vasari, in his Lives of the Artists, and going through biographies of artists who lived from the late 13th century up to his own time in the 16th century, he does mention on occasion some female patrons. Women as patrons of art tended to fall into three different categories. They were wives, usually the wives of rulers, the consorts of kings and dukes and counts. They were widows, because widows often had more control over their finances than they did as wives. And they were nuns. And so I'll just give you one example of a particularly prominent female patron who you see in the portrait on the left. And this portrait's located in Vienna, in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. It was painted by the famous Venetian artist Titian. And her name was Isabella d'Este. The d'Este family were the rulers of the northern Italian city of Ferrara. So she grew up in a Renaissance court, a very cultured setting. She based a lot of her patronage activities on those of the male members of the family whose patronage she was able to observe. But she became a nearly unparalleled patron of art and a collector who was really unusual for her time. She so dominated the literature, the study and Renaissance studies on female patrons that in 2001, there were a couple of art historians who came out with a book called Beyond Isabella. It's like, okay, I'll write enough with Isabella d'Este. Let's, see what else happened other than Isabella. But what you're seeing in the image over on the right is part of the castle in which she lived when she, in Mantua, which is where she spent her married life. Because as you can see, she's born in Ferrara in 1474. She was the daughter of the ruler of Ferrara, this Ercole I d'Este. But then she married the Marchese, the Marquis of the city of Mantua, which is not too far from Ferrara. It's also in northern Italy, in the year 1490. And it was in that castle that she created a set of apartments for herself, very celebrated apartments. It was common in the Renaissance for male patrons in particular to have studies, what are called studioli. And in these studies, they would collect different kinds of objects, anything from exotic seashells to classical works from classical antiquity, usually on a fairly small scale. You would have manuscripts, beautifully illuminated, beautifully illustrated manuscripts, all of these things that you could enjoy on your own, or you can invite maybe one or two other people into your study to discuss these works, to, just simply revel in the beauty of the craftsmanship, the meaning, the antiquity. And so she's one of the few women who established one of these studies, her studiolo. In addition, she had something she called her grotta, which was her grotto, in which she housed some of her most precious objects. She filled these with works that glorified herself. On the left, you see another object that is also in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna, and it's a portrait medal. Now, portrait medals began to be produced at about the middle of the 15th century and were first off predominantly associated with the Italian Renaissance courts. They're based on ancient coins, usually that were decorated with images of ancient Roman emperors or empresses. And so you have a profile portrait of the person who's being featured. And so here we see Isabella d'Este, who is identified in the inscription that goes around it. There's her profile portrait with her nice loose hair there. But this is like a super duper version of one of these portrait medals. Usually they're cast in bronze, and bronze was expensive. Bronze was a very prestigious medium. But this particular example is made in gold, and then it's embellished with gems. And she kept this one in her own possession. Normally you take the bronze versions and you would give them almost as calling cards or business cards to friends and associates. You could send them to other courts. And we know that in her grotto, Isabella d'Este displayed this medal in close proximity to the ancient cameo that you see on the right, which is also in Vienna. It dates from the 3rd century BC, and it depicts some ruling members, Ptolemaic members of the Ptolemy family of ancient Egypt. And so here you could juxtapose the modern rendition of Isabella d'Este, the patron, with the ancient work, because the juxtaposition of the contemporary and the classical is one of the hallmarks of Renaissance society. She also, or Renaissance culture, I should say, she also owned this, or at least a version of this small bronze statue, which is a copy after a famous large marble statue that's in the Vatican museums that was part of the papal collections. It's called the Apollo Belvedere. So her tastes definitively leaned towards the classical, the mythological, and the secular. And in this, she is also outstanding, because most female patrons, whether they're nuns, wives, widows, a lot of their patronage tended to focus on sacred works, altarpieces for chapels, devotional images, things like that. And Isabella was not afraid to promote herself, both through that medal or through the paintings that decorated the walls of her study. This is just one of them, a painting by the Mantuan court artist Andrea Mantegna, in which you see the goddess Pallas Athena over here, who's charging into the scene and expelling all of these vices. So these kind of mutilated, kind of shockingly deformed looking figures who represent vices, and she's triumphing with the help of virtues who are in the sky above. And the image of Pallas Athena is basically a thinly disguised portrait of Isabella d'Este herself. Another woman who figures in Vasari's Lives of the Artists very briefly is Vittoria Colonna, who, unlike Isabella d'Este, was not known for her interest in classical arts and classical antiquity and collecting, but instead for her piety and for her erudition. She was a great intellect. She was a very talented poet, and she also was in possession of some very fine works of art by leading artists such as Titian. We know from a number of documents that she acquired an image of the penitent Magdalene, Saint Mary Magdalene. Whether it was this one that you see over here, which is from the Pitti Palace in Florence, is uncertain. There are several versions of Titian's paintings of the Magdalene that survive, but we do know that she had one of these. She was also a great friend of Michelangelo. And Michelangelo made for her a series of drawings. We call these presentation drawings because they're highly finished drawings that were meant to serve as gifts, to really act as works of art in and of themselves, as opposed to just being preparatory studies for a painting or a sculpture or something like that. And she and Michelangelo were both very devout, and he tailored the imagery of the drawings that he made for her to her pious needs. An image of the crucified Christ, or an image of the Pietà, this image in which you see the dead Christ and the Virgin Mary above him, mourning his death. And so these are some of the women, some of the most prominent women that we know about from the period. Vasari mentions Vittoria Colonna, actually not in conjunction with either the Titian painting or the Michelangelo drawings. Instead, he mentions her as a poet in the life that he included in his Lives of the Artists of a woman artist from Bologna. Her name was Propertia de Rossi. And on the right, you see the first page of her biography in Vasari's Lives. One of the differences between the first and the second editions of Vasari's Lives is that the second edition included these woodcut portraits. So here's Propertia de Rossi. The title down below tells us that this is the life of Propertia de Rossi, Bolognese sculptor. And he has a little allegorical figure of sculpture representing the art of sculpture, a female figure who has a chisel in one hand, or sorry, chisel in this hand, a hammer in this hand, and is busy working on carving this, this little bust up here. Propertia de Rossi, coming from Bologna, she is one of many women artists that came from that city. And just to get you situated, here's Florence, Rome is down here. Bologna is located north of the Apennines. So I was talking about Mantua is right here, Ferrara is right here. So Bologna is in essentially kind of the same area north of the Apennines. And Bologna was home to more woman artists than any other city in Italy. I just got my copy of the book whose cover you see in my over on the right. It just came in last week. It was just published this year by a scholar named Babette Bone, who teaches at Texas Christian University in Texas. And she spent quite a bit of time exploring this, and she has identified no fewer than 68 women artists from Bologna who worked between the 15th and the 18th centuries. Why Bologna? Well, for one thing, Bologna was a university town, and university towns tend to have vibrant cultures, often tend to be a bit more progressive than some other places. And what Bone has concluded is that it was, because Bologna was a university town, there was an intellectual community there, it was possible for women to enjoy some greater freedoms. And so you had women artists coming from various walks of life. We don't really know anything about the training of Propertia de Rossi. And the interesting thing about her is that most women artists are painters. A few are printmakers, but most of them are painters. The idea of a woman sculptor was something that fascinated both Vasari and other people of the time, because it was very unusual to have a woman who was carving works of art. I will read to you a little bit of what Vasari says about her. So he's talking about, women artists. He names a few others, one of whom I'll mention in just a little bit. But with regard to Propertia particularly, he says, braving the roughness of marble and the unkindly chisels in order to attain their desire and thereby win fame, as Propertia did in her own day. He says, Propertia de Rossi of Bologna, a young woman excellent not only in household matters, so it's not just art, she's good at home too, like the rest of them, but also in sciences without number, so that all men, to say nothing of the women, were envious of her. This Propertia was very beautiful in person, and played and sang in her day better than any other woman of her city. And because she had an intellect, both capricious and very ready, she set herself to carve peach stones, which she executed so well and with such patience that they were singular and marvelous to behold, not only for the subtlety of the work, but also for the grace of the little figures she made in them and the delicacy with which they were distributed. So Propertia de Rossi, she carves marble, and I'll show you an example of her marble carving, but she also carved fruit stones. This is actually not a peach pit, this is a cherry stone, and this is object is part of the collection of the Pitti Palace in Florence. And so you see the carved cherry pit there, it's in a mount and obviously was used as some kind of pendant. And it's a little bit difficult to see what the carving is, and I apologize for the detail, it's really hard to get good images of this, but it has like 100 little faces. Do you see the eyes here and the nose? You can make out all of these little faces. And so the delicacy of this carving and the fact that it was made by a woman artist made it all that more special. As a marble carver, we have this work that survives from the hands of Properti de Rossi. And I'm not an artist. I have no artistic talent whatsoever, but this is carved out of marble. And as far as stones are concerned, marble is fairly soft, but it's still a stone. And marble carving is tough, dirty, labor-intensive work. Yet Properti de Rossi made this beautiful relief. It was made for the facade of the most important church in Bologna, the Church of San Petronio. Never was installed there, but it shows an Old Testament scene of Joseph. And this is the wife of a captain of the Pharaoh's army who was trying to seduce him, and he escaped. But as he was getting away, she grabs his cloak and she keeps it, and later on she uses it to essentially accuse him of seducing her, which he did not. I'm 23 minutes. Okay, so I'm just going to keep plowing on through. Another woman artist who Vasari mentions in his life of Properti de Rossi was celebrated internationally during her day. Her name was Sophonisba Anguissola. She was the daughter of a nobleman from Cremona, but they were impoverished nobility. And the man had 5 daughters, which poses a problem, because if you want to marry your daughters, you always have to provide dowries for them, which can get quite expensive. Her father was unusual for his time in that he trained all 5 of his daughters in the arts as artists and musicians. The most famous of them was Sophonisba, who became so celebrated for her art that she actually wound up going to the court of Spain, where she served as a lady in waiting to the Queen of Spain and helped the Queen, teach the Queen how to paint. She actually had a very long life, as you can see from the dates I have here. And during her career, she produced at least 12 self-portraits. The one you see on the left here is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. And so if you're ever in Boston, you can go say hello. The other one is a really beautiful, engaging, small, exquisitely painted portrait of her sisters who are engaged in playing a game of chess. This one is looking out. She's happy. She's about to make a move. This one knows that she's about to make a move that is going to help her win the game. And the little sister looking on is completely on board. She knows what's going on. And there's the nurse or the servant who's kind of looking on as almost a motherly like figure. That servant, oops, sorry, I just lost my slide, shows up in another self-portrait of Sophonisba, in which she presents herself not so much as an artist, but as a musician. And this is a type that was picked up by Lavinia Fontana, another woman artist from Bologna, probably the most famous of the Bolognese women artists, who likewise depicts herself as a musician, sitting at a spinet with a servant bringing her some music here. The only hint of the fact that she's an artist comes in the inscription, which I'll read to you in just a moment, and the easel in the background, the empty easel there. This painting, I always talk about this painting as being her Tinder profile, her online dating profile, because this was made to be sent to a prospective husband, a guy by the name of Gianpaolo Zappi. And, it went to him and to his family so they could see what she looked like before they got married. The inscription reads, Lavinia, the unmarried daughter of Prospero Fontana, took her image from the mirror in 1577. Lavinia Fontana was like most women artists in that her father was an artist too. So she would be able to train with him, but there were limits as to what women artists could be trained in. They did not study from live models. Very often they were confined to the workshops of their fathers. And so they always weren't able to get out and, study other works of art. Sometimes they could, but not always like male artists could. And what they needed was a husband for her who could allow her to pursue her career as an artist because she supported her family. She was the breadwinner. So all through her career, she's working. She has 11 children. Only 4 of them survive into adolescence. And her husband essentially becomes her manager, because even though she's the breadwinner, she still needs to rely on a man in order to navigate the world of selling, patrons, commissions, things like that. And so that's just important reality of the time. I was going to talk to you a bit about Artemisia Gentileschi, but I'm running low on time. So I just wanted to wind up by pointing out that the study of women artists is growing exponentially all the time. Last year was an important year, although it was stymied, like all of our lives, by the COVID pandemic, because there was a major exhibition on one of the most famous women artists, a Baroque painter by the name of Artemisia Gentileschi, who, like Lavinia Fontana, was the daughter of a painter. This was held at the National Gallery in London. They actually delayed the exhibition and did wind up opening it. Another one that was less fortunate was an exhibition on Giovanna Garzoni, who painted wonderful still lives. So you can see the cherries in this image from the webpage of the Pitti Palace in Florence. And this exhibition opened up well, it didn't open up because of the lockdown in Italy because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And since I've been teaching this class on women artists, I've been, especially attuned to things that are happening. The market for women artists and their work has been just exploding, so that and I'm having trouble seeing this in my screen. So this is just this is April. The Virginia Museum of Fine Arts acquired a painting by Lavinia Fontana. The Getty Museum out in California recently acquired a painting by Artemisia Gentileschi. And the Met in New York just received a donation of a painting by an artist named Ursula Maddalena Caccia, who I had never heard of before this came up on my feed. And so I just like to leave you with the thought that in case anybody ever thought that everything in the Renaissance has been done, that's mistaken on all counts, for male artists, female artists, but there's so much more that we can learn from it. And so I will stop now. I went a little bit over my allotted time, but I'm going to stop my share, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Sally. That was super interesting and really cool. I have some questions, but I'm going to encourage people to enter their questions into the chat box, and I will relay them to Professor Cornelison. There's a couple that came in as you were talking, and I'll start with those, but people should start when filling them in, and we'll try to get to them all. Ashley had a question going back to the Isabella medal. How big was that, and what's the size and scale?
It's small. It's small. These medals are very small. They're usually just a couple of inches across. So you can hold them in your hand. They're meant to be turned over. Most of them have images on the back, allegorical images, usually attesting to the virtues of the person who's represented on the medal. The bronze versions of that medal do have allegorical images on the back, but the gold version does not. It's all of its bling is on the front.
And you said that bronze was a more precious metal?
Okay, so bronze is expensive, but the gold and the gems of the example that I showed you is far more prestigious and far more expensive than the more common bronze versions that you usually find that were made for both men and women.
Okay. Emily had asked, do we know if De Rossi had a workshop or studio like male sculptor counterparts, or did she do all the carving herself?
Okay, we don't know a whole lot about her and her working methods. And because I was so pressed for time, I didn't get to talk a whole lot about her. She was evidently a rather troubled soul. She shows up in the records of Bologna for being arrested on a couple of occasions. Once for destroying a vine and some elements in a garden of another artist. Another time, she and an associate attacked a painter. She scratched his eyes and threw paint at him. So she evidently had a volatile personality. Again, we don't know where she was trained. it's hard to say whether she had a workshop or not. My inclination would probably be maybe not, but we just don't know. There's so little information on how she worked, but the fact that she was sculpting is remarkable in many ways. Vasari, when he talks about that relief that I showed you, he pitches it that she depicted that scene of Joseph and Potiphar's wife because she was infatuated with a young man who didn't return her love, just like Joseph didn't return the love of Potiphar's wife, and essentially presents her as this this stilted lover, and that's kind of the reputation that's come down to us. But of course, the iconography of the relief would never be up to her. That would be up to the people who commissioned it.
So Elaine commented that we didn't give you enough time and she wants to hear more, and I would agree that we want to hear more. Did you have some more material that you had prepared?
I do. Do you want to hear it?
I'd love to hear some more.
Okay.
I bet the group would too.
Let me share. I'm sharing. Okay, let me go. So I had worked in Artemisia, and it's kind of criminal. So thank you, Elaine. Criminal to talk about Italian women artists and the early modern period without giving her her due. She is, but the interesting thing is that the first book that was published on Artemisia Gentileschi dates from 1989. So it's still recent. And there are now a number of monographs, and there's a nice catalog from the exhibition that just happened in London. I realized today that I left my copy at the office. But Artemisia was the daughter of Orazio Gentileschi, and he was a very talented painter himself. And I had the good fortune, some of you may have seen this, that back in 2002, there was a major exhibition on both Orazio and Artemisia Gentileschi, which featured the paintings of both of them. And I have a little excerpt from a letter that Orazio wrote to the Dowager Grand Duchess of Florence, Christine of Lorraine, in 1612, in which he's writing to her about his daughter. And he says, having been active in the profession now for 3 years, Artemisia has learned so much that I can dare to say that there are few equal to her, and that some major painters of our time cannot match her skills. She's famous for a number of reasons. For her skill, the fact that she was a woman artist. She probably is the most famous of all of the artists that I've talked about today. She moved around quite a bit. So she grows up in Rome, and and she would have had an opportunity to see things in Rome, but we know that her father kept her under pretty tight wraps, that she was not allowed to, just simply go wandering around. That didn't necessarily help her, because she wound up being raped by one of his assistants, and that resulted in a very well documented rape trial. And eventually she moves to Florence. She becomes a member of the Accademia del Disegno, which is the first art academy. She's not the first woman member of the Accademia. Often she's billed as being that, but she's actually not. She travels to England. And as a matter of fact, the self-portrait that I'm showing you here on the left belongs to the collection of the Queen of England. And it's basically a portrait of Artemisia as the allegorical figure of painting. She embodies the art of painting, and there she is, working away on her canvas with her palette in her hand. She eventually winds up in Naples, and there are a number of issues related to. Oftentimes scholars tend to do this. You can't ever divorce an artist's biography from their work, but with the women artists, and Artemisia in particular, scholars have tended to really see herself in her work, probably more than you normally would a male artist. And there have been questions about, what she did. Oops, let me go back. With this painting, which is a fairly early one, dates from about 1611, 1612, when she was between about 18 and 19 years old. In that exhibition I mentioned of Orazio and Artemisia Gentileschi, there are two separate catalog entries for this painting, because one of the exhibition's curators, Keith Christensen from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, thinks it's by Orazio, whereas Judith Mann, who's the curator at the St. Louis Art Museum, and the exhibition was on at both venues,
thinks it's Artemisia. And so I put a little question mark there. I tend to side with Judy Mann. I think that this probably is Artemisia, but she does tend to represent the female nude in less idealized, more realistic manner than some male artists. And that's led some scholars to say, well, maybe she's painting herself. And I had a leading scholar on Italian women artists, somebody who's actually writing a book on Artemisia right now, Sheila Barker. She came and talked to my class last week and gave a lecture. And I brought that issue up and she said, nobody would ever ask the same question about a male artist. Is Michelangelo, sculpting himself? No, probably not. So you can't necessarily assume that, but she does present very distinctive images of the female nude. This is a slightly earlier painting, and this is dated to 1610. She actually did date it. And so this dates from about when she was 17 years old. And it's a painting that depicts the Old Testament story of Susanna, who was a beautiful woman, and she was married, but these elders in the town that she lived in, became infatuated with her, and they essentially accosted her while she was bathing and tried to get her to sleep with them, and she refused. And then later they basically told everyone that she had, and she had to clear her name, which eventually happens after a lot of trial and tribulation. But this is a really, this is a subject that is not uncommon in the history of art. We have medieval ivory caskets that depict the story of Suzanne and the elders, and most prominent male artists of her time, Veronese and others, Rubens, depicted Susanna. But there's a kind of pathos in the way that she represents the distress of Susanna that many people have linked to the kinds of harassments that she would have been subjected to, and that ultimately resulted in her rape by her father's assistant. Although interestingly enough, later in her life, she did this painting of Susanna, and it's a very different kind of picture. It's actually much more in keeping with the kinds of Susanna paintings that male artists made. She painted other types of scenes. She's very well known for her images of Judith and Holofernes, another Old Testament story. This is actually apocryphal, so it's not part of the canon of the Old Testament, but Judith is a beautiful Jewish heroine who saves her people from the menace of the Assyrian army general Holofernes, basically by making him fall in love with her. He gets very drunk and then she cuts his head off. And so I'm showing you just 3 of her Judith paintings. This one's in Detroit. By the way, there's going to be an Artemisia exhibition at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. It's going to start at the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Connecticut in the fall, and then it's going to go to the Detroit Institute of Arts. And so just, a shout out for that in case you are able to catch it. This is one of the 2 very gory depictions of the decapitation with blood spurting, and she's just, using every ounce of strength she has in order to cut his head off. And then, but these are all just really very moody, beautifully painted works of art that really, justify the attention that Artemisia has received. And I'll just, go back to what I started off with that Linda Nochlin article, why have there been no great women artists? And, we're at a point now, I think, where, yes, there are great women artists like Lavinia Fontana, like Sophonisba, like Artemisia Gentileschi, but then there are also some less great works. But the fact that, some women artists maybe aren't quite as accomplished as their male counterparts doesn't really diminish the value of what they're doing, because there's some very modest works by nuns and other artists, but they are, remain very interesting in their own right. Okay, Elaine, was that good? Is that enough? That's what I had. I can't hear you, John.
Sorry, thank you. I got a couple of things in the chat I want to relay to you. Ashley asked if you could possibly share a list of the publications, articles, and books you were mentioning in the lecture. She wants to read them all.
Sure. Yeah, just write to me. SJCornell@syr.edu. Actually, a leading scholar in the study of women in art, Patricia Simons, has a Google Doc that's publicly available, which is a huge bibliography of both women artists and women patrons, and not just Italy, but also Northern Europe in the Middle Ages and the early modern period. So it's, I mean, it's exhaustive, but that's a really great open access source.
Oh, good. Hey, Liz, would you mind dropping Sally's email into the chat? Thank you. Richard had a question, and I had the same one. You'd mentioned initially that nuns were patrons as well. And, you know, given that I thought nuns took a vow of poverty, how did they have the resource to sponsor artists?
Some nuns were fairly wealthy,
Okay.
and there were some very wealthy convents. It just depended. And it depends on the order that you belong to. So if you're a Franciscan nun, if you're a member of the Poor Clares, then yes. But if you're a Benedictine nun, then not so much. And so in my class, we talked about a variety of nuns as patrons. One of them was a member of the Medici family, who was an abbess of a convent called Santa Verdiana in Florence, who was responsible for commissioning works of art. There were important things that were produced during the period that she was in charge of that convent. One of my favorite cases is the abbess of the convent of San Paolo in Parma, a woman named Giovanna da Piacenza, who commissioned Correggio, who's a very important 16th century painter from around Parma, to decorate her private chambers. And it's covered with, it's the vault of the room, and then the chimney of the fireplace, and there's not a single reference to Christianity. It's all mythological. There's the goddess Diana, there are little Cupid figures, little putti, there are goddesses, and it's very interesting. It's a place where she would interact with the people coming to do convent business, and there's not an ounce of religiosity in it.
Jennifer asked about, she said she loved the inventory scene you showed at the beginning with the Cassoni chests. Do you know what oratory in Florence it's from?
Yeah, Jenny, that's in the Oratory of San Martino. So it's part of those Ghirlandaio school scenes. There were really good ones. There's a great betrothal scene there as well. And I can send you the image if you want, but it's the oratory belonged to a lay confraternity, the Buonomini di San Martino, the good men of St. Martin. And so they did charitable works. And one of the things they did was to look after the assets and the welfare of widows and children. And so that inventory scene, as I mentioned, is probably a scene of them essentially. You would take inventories usually when somebody died. And so presumably the woman's husband had died. And so they can, and that's how we know a lot about domestic art, is there are tons and tons of these palace inventories in the Florentine State Archives. So scholars have gone in and, you know, they know what people had in their rooms and what they had in their chests. And yeah.
Okay. Christopher asked about the Connecticut Museum that will have the exhibition, and it's the Wadsworth Athenaeum.
It's the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford.
In Hartford, okay.
All right.
Thank you.
And it's, I looked it up. I'm going to be gone next fall, so I'm going to miss that. I'll try to catch it in Detroit. And I think it's September that it opens. I don't remember. But if you go to the Wadsworth site, they can, you'll find it because it's there in their upcoming exhibitions.
Okay. Liz had a question. Why would the field think that there were no great women artists? Was it lack of attribution and people didn't realize that women made these great pieces? Or was it just, you know, your basic sexism or whatever?
Yeah, that basically, it's your basic misogyny. It just, you know, women artists were not studied, and there were a few. I mean, even during their lifetimes, you know, Lavinia Fontana, Sophonisba, Artemisia, they were viewed as marvels of their time because they were so rare. I think that's why people wanted all of those self-portraits of Sophonisba Anguissola, but it's always the men who are driving the car, and there just really hadn't been the groundwork done on it. And especially for those works that maybe are less accomplished artistically, but still have a lot of cultural value and social value, that, you know, art history, it's only very recently that we've started to look past issues of, you know, greatness and attribution, because art historians for a long time were concerned with, you know, who did this and style. And so now we contextualize things so much more in terms of, you know, who's making them, who are they made for, you know, how are they seen? What do they mean? So it's a really great time to be an art historian.
Hmm. Jillian had a question. Which is your favorite woman artist that you have discovered or learned about since starting
Oh.
your Women in Renaissance art class?
That's a good question. I always have a soft spot for Properzia because she's such an interesting character, and the thing that makes my heart really go pitter patter is sculpture. And the truth is that I am learning along with the students. And so we're going to be covering some artists this semester that I still don't know that much about. So for example, next week, we're going to be looking at women artists from Lombardy. So that's the northern Italian region that includes Mantua and Milan and places like that. And there's an engraver by the name of, she's either called Diana Mantuana or Diana Scultori, who was the daughter of a printmaker. And I know very little about her. And so I'm really looking forward to learning more about that. Just for the sheer looking at it, Artemisia is pretty great. She's pretty hard to beat. They're all, yeah, I don't know. It's hard to play favorites.
Question about fruit stones as a medium. How common was that?
It wasn't that common, but we did Properzia last week, and so I started thinking about it. There were people who did these little bitty miniature boxwood carvings that were really tiny things. But the fruit stones, not very common. There are other examples in Northern Europe that are very similar to the one that that cherry stone that I showed you by Properzia de Rossi. But there were all sorts of unlikely things that they sculpted. We know that famous artists like Gian Bologna, who worked for the Medici, he made sugar sculptures. And those were things that would be displayed on tables for banquets and things. And then you could eat them. So, you know, the gamut of what people were sculpting with is actually much broader than I think we probably tend to think of.
Wow, very cool. Well, unless anyone else has additional questions, I think we are ready to wrap things up. And Sally, unless you had any additional comments, I just want to say, I want to thank you. This was fascinating. And I know, you know, we're approaching the end of the semester, and I can't imagine how busy you are. So really, thank you so much for taking time to prepare this and present it for us. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, and I want to thank
all of you for coming.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining us. We really appreciate your interest and your support, and it really means a lot. And keep an eye out for more invitations to events like this. It's a lot of fun, and we appreciate you being here. And with that, we're going to sign off. Take care, everybody.